What you're about to hear is a true story. It's the story of 11-year-old Deidre Vruwink who was struck and killed while riding her bike home from play practice. Her story has never been told like this. Today, March 24, 2025, marks 30 years since her death. That's 3 decades the family has been waiting for justice. But did they ever get a true investigation in the first place? When I first came across this case, there was a running theme I continued to see. Just how pathetic the Wood County Sheriff's investigation was, and the term cover-up continued to pop up over and over and over. But I wasn't quite convinced. But after months of research and my own public records requests to the Wisconsin DOJ and the Wood County Sheriff's Department were both stonewalled for the most ridiculous reasons, I can honestly say there's something very wrong with this case. So what are they hiding? Is it the town sheriff's close ties to the suspects? The incompetent excuse for an investigation? Or maybe the sheriff's drug dependency and mental breakdown he had during the investigation? Well, you'll be able to decide for yourself when I lay out the facts like they've never been before. This is Collision of Silence. This documentary is intended for informational purposes only and is based on public available information. All individuals mentioned are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. No criminal charges have been brought against any of the parties featured, and the content presented does not imply guilt or wrongdoing. As public servants, law enforcement agencies and officials are subject to public scrutiny, and this documentary examines their actions and decisions as part of a broader discussion of the case. Any critique of public officials is based on facts of the case. Additionally, this documentary does not reflect my personal opinions on any private citizen involved. However, where relevant, it does include widely discussed public perceptions of those individuals to provide context on how the case has been received. Please consider liking and commenting on the video. That does help get the video out to more people. Share it on social media. The more eyes we have on this video, the more chance we have to get this case solved and to serve justice to whoever did this to Deidre. The year is 1995. The day was Friday, March 24th, shortly before 5 p.m. 11-year-old Deidre Vruwink was getting ready to go to her play practice. Before leaving, she asked her father David for some money so she can stop and get a treat for her and her brother from Winch's Mini Mart. David pulled out a $20 bill, smallest bill he had, and gave it to her. Deidre then left the Vruwink resident wearing a light-colored jacket, green pants, and riding her bicycle that she had just gotten for Christmas a few months prior. After Deidre left, David started cleaning the house and doing various other chores. Deidre's practice ended around 6:15 p.m. That is confirmed by a lady named Virginia Brock, a mother of another child that was at the same practice. From practice, Deidre rode her bike to Winch's gas station, where she purchased a couple of candy bars and a can of soda. Also at Winch's was a man named Jim Vruwink and his daughter. Jim was there to meet David and Julie Fram, a couple interested in purchasing a vehicle from him. After taking the car for a test drive, the Frams agreed to the purchase for $4,200. There was, however, one contingency. There was a piece of trim missing from around one of the wheel wells. Jim said he actually had the piece at his home and agreed to run back and get it. It was about a 2-mile drive. The Frams offered to just follow him back, but Jim said he would just run and grab it and be right back. Meanwhile, after David finished washing the dishes, he looked up at the clock, saying it was already 6:20 p.m. He remembered that he had 2 people coming over, one around 6:30 and the other around 7 for guitar lessons. David then went in the back room and grabbed some pails and stepped out back to feed the dogs. Around 6:30, Jim got into a small vehicle, a Ford or Chevy, gray in color, and left the gas station. This puts Deidre and Jim both on County Highway HH just after 6:30 p.m. After being out back for about 10 minutes, approximate time now is 6:30 p.m., David heard a vehicle with a loud exhaust coming from the north. Shortly after this, he heard a loud noise as he describes as a, quote, tin thud, end quote. After hearing the noise, David began to worry a little about his daughter. He quickly finished feeding the dogs after a few minutes, returned the pails, and got in his red Chevy Cheyenne to go look for Deidre. When David put his truck in gear, 2 vehicles drove by, one described as a larger vehicle and the second as a smaller silver gray car. The cars were driving an estimated 55 miles an hour and had about a 3 to 5 second break between them. After the cars passed, David pulled out of his driveway onto CTHH, heading south towards Vesper. As he passed Hayes Lane, he could see Deidre's bike laying in the northbound lane on CTHH near the entrance to a wooded area. He rolled down his windows and started calling out for his daughter. At this point, David recalled thinking Deidre had possibly found a dog or a bunny near the woods, jumped off her bike, and started to approach it. David continued driving in desperate search of Deidre, frantically checking both the east and west ditches. As David approached neighbor Randy Burkholtz's residence, he stated that is when he saw his daughter, laying on the east side of the road in a ditch. He immediately slammed his truck into park in the Burkholtz's driveway and ran across the street, jumping down into the ditch to tend to Deidre. David said when he got to Deidre, she was on her back with her eyes halfway open and didn't seem to be breathing. After kissing and holding his daughter, David realized he needed to get help. He looked over at the Griffins' residence and saw no lights on. He saw a light on in the Burkholtz's residence and ran over. After knocking on the door a couple times, he just let himself in. Inside, the Burkholtz family were watching the television in the living room. Prior to David entering their home, Randy and Irene Burkholtz heard a thud outside. They described it as if someone had slammed their car door shut. About 10 minutes after hearing the noise and continuing to watch television, the doorbell rang. Randy got up to answer the door, but before he could open the door, a panicked and bloody David Week entered the Burkholtz's residence, begging for them to call 911 because someone had just hit his daughter. Irene Burkholtz dialed 911 and told the dispatcher that a guy came into their house and said his daughter was just hit by a car. Back at the gas station, the Frams were waiting for Jim to return in their newly purchased vehicle. It was sometime between 6:30 and 6:50 p.m. Actually, a more accurate time would have been 6:40 to 6:45 when they saw an ambulance leaving the station across the street. About 5 to 10 minutes after that, a vehicle pulled into the gas station. A white male, approximately 6 foot tall, 170 pounds, wearing a baseball cap, exited his vehicle and started to approach them. This man was Lonnie Grosskowitz, an employee at TJ's Auto, Jim's car lot. He handed the trim piece to them and said Jim had witnessed a hit and run. Back at the Burkholtz residence, Matt Molnar, the boyfriend of Terry Burkholtz, quickly put on his shoes after hearing that David's daughter was hit and went back to the accident site with David. Shortly after, Randy put his shoes on as well. He also stated he grabbed a blanket off the bed in case that could help Deidre in some way. As soon as Randy reached the end of the driveway, he could see Deidre laying in the ditch. When Randy made his way closer to Deidre, he saw a devastated David Week cradling his daughter. Shortly after, David moved her body. Quote, "You probably shouldn't do that," Matt told him. David said he couldn't just leave her laying in water and gently laid her back down. Randy got down into the ditch and put the blanket over Deidre's body, then took her hand and tried to feel for a pulse. Randy stated later that Deidre did not have a pulse. Her hands were cold to the touch. She had one eye open and blood coming from her nose and ears. Randy saw Deidre's bike laying in the east ditch, north of where she landed. David later stated that he was so overwhelmed with emotion that he just couldn't take it anymore and had to leave the scene. He got back in his truck and drove down the road to his home. When he arrived, he told his son Brandon that his sister was just hit by a car and not doing well. He dialed 911. He also made a couple of phone calls to other members of the family, including his wife Brenda and Deidre's grandmother. David was so distraught that he had difficulty dialing the correct number of Brenda's mother. After notifying family members of the accident, Jason Hines arrived for his guitar lesson, driving a silver Ford Mustang. Fairly shortly after Jason arrived, the second person for guitar lessons, Kurt Sperling, along with his fiancée Tanya, arrived driving a blue van. Just imagine for a second the amount of stress and anxiety David is feeling at this time. His daughter was just struck by a vehicle which had fled the scene. He just broke the news to several family members, and now he has 3 people in his face asking what happened. And he has to explain the traumatic experience that he hasn't even been able to process himself. No one would have blamed David for curling up in the fetal position in his bed and never coming out. Randy Burkholtz, still at the scene, heard sirens and decided to go up the road to flag them down. After the first responders arrived on the scene, Jim Vruwink also arrived and immediately asked, quote, "Who moved the bike? It was in the middle of the road," end quote. Randy responded, quote, "It was in the ditch when I arrived," end quote. James went on to explain to Randy that he actually saw the accident and claims he tried to chase the striking vehicle but was unsuccessful.
Dennis and Deborah Dietrich were two EMTs who arrived at the scene to try and help Deidre. The two first responders were driving with their children on CTF when Dennis received a page at about 6:45 p.m. informing him that an individual was just struck by a car. They decided to turn around and head back to the scene in Vesper. When they arrived, Vesper Rescue was already on the scene. Dennis got out of the car first and recalled seeing Deidre, who he figured was 10 to 12 years old, lying on the east side of the road. Dennis noticed that Deidre had severe trauma to the rear right of her head. Deborah provided hands-on care to Deidre, while Dennis acted as a gopher for whatever she needed, such as a flashlight, a suction unit, providing updates to dispatch, etc. They moved Deidre to the back of an ambulance for transport, but quickly changed their course of action and called for a helicopter to transport her due to the severity of her injuries. Dennis guided the Spirit of Marshfield helicopter to where it should land. However, before it could do so, Jim Vruwink was asked to move his vehicle. After Jim moved his vehicle, it broke down and had to be towed away, but more on that later. After the helicopter left to transport Deidre to the hospital, Dennis said Deborah Dietrich, along with their children, went to the Weeks residence to inform David of Deidre's condition and try to convince him to let them take him to the hospital. Dennis stated David was reluctant to go to the hospital, which is completely understandable, but after some convincing, they went to the hospital together. Dennis had someone dispatched to the Weeks home to take Brenda Week to the hospital when she arrived home from work. As they pulled into St. Joseph's Hospital, David seemed to already know the news he would be getting would be bad. Silence filled the air as David sat in the waiting room of the hospital, still accompanied by the Dietrich family. A doctor came in and spoke to David. Tragically, Deidre had succumbed to her injuries. Dennis Dietrich commented later that when David heard the news, he did not seem surprised. I believe he already knew his daughter would pass due to the severity of her injuries. The Wood County Sheriff's Department started an investigation into Deidre Weeks' death. Overseeing the case was Sheriff Brian Illingworth, which we'll get into his glaring conflict of interest in the case a little later, and lead investigator Tom Reichert. From the outside looking in, it seemed to be a semi-simple case. Follow the facts and find the driver. However, this quickly becomes a convoluted investigation and what many believe to be a cover-up. The truth lied with the eyewitness, Jim Vruwink. Before we get into the investigation reports, we need to hear Jim's story he told an officer at the scene. Deputy Ray Starks and Sergeant Michael Sways were dispatched to the accident scene at 6:44 p.m. when they were told by dispatch that a girl on a bike was hit by a car and that the striking vehicle had taken off. When they arrived, first responders were already working on Deidre. Sergeant Sways observed Deidre's belongings and pieces of clothing scattered along the road. Also arriving on the scene was Officer Barris, who spoke with Sergeant Sways and was instructed to speak with Jim to get his statement. The sergeant also told Officer Barris that Jim had damage to the front end of his vehicle and could possibly be a suspect. While the two were speaking, Jim came up to them and informed them that his vehicle had actually broken down and requested a ride home so he could return with a flatbed. Officer Barris and Sergeant Sways obliged and took the opportunity to get as much information from Jim as possible while they were in his squad car on the way to Jim's home. Jim described the striking vehicle as a burgundy or maroon four-door intermediate-sized car, possibly a Chevrolet Celebrity with two occupants, and fled north on CTHHH. Jim said he was working on someone's car. This is the car he's selling, not working on, to the Frams. While driving southbound on CTHHH, he saw a vehicle going northbound when it appeared to hit an object when he saw dust and debris fly everywhere. When he got closer and saw it was a person that was hit, he turned around and chased the striking vehicle. Jim says he never got close enough to see the license plate and ultimately lost the vehicle near the bend at Tempest Road. Jim explained that once he realized he wouldn't be able to catch up to the car, he headed to his home so he could call 911. After making the call, he decided to change his vehicle. This is the tan-colored Ford Taurus that had the front end damage and later broke down. Jim says the reason for this is so that he could have a faster car. As they continued on, they arrived near the curve on CTHHH, the approximate spot where Jim lost the striking vehicle. This is where they saw two individuals tending to a fire in their front yard. They pulled a squad car over to speak with these individuals. Officer Bears was told by the man, Robert B. Cronstead, that he and his wife were doing work inside the house, so they were in and out all day. Although they didn't see much, Robert did say shortly after 6:30 p.m. or so, he saw a vehicle headed south on CTHHH towards Vesper and going at a high rate of speed, squealing the tires and beeping its horn around the curve. After leaving the Cronstead residence, the squad car continued north on CTHHH. They asked Jim to point out any vehicles he sees that may look familiar. Jim makes a random comment that he doesn't know anyone who lives in this area. The squad car makes a stop so they could get out and inspect the vehicles in a parking lot. None of the vehicles at this location matched the description of the striking vehicle, nor did any of them look to have been just moved. After coming up empty on the search for a vehicle that matched Jim's description, they dropped him off at his home. I just want to point out it's kind of odd to me that they took Jim, who they state is still a possible suspect at this time, with them on their investigation while they interviewed possible suspects and witnesses. They already had a description of the vehicle, so they didn't really need him present during their search. Sergeant Swayze and Officer Barris visited the local taverns in the area. They went to JoJo's Tavern, located at 140 Cameron Street in Vesper. After speaking with the bar owner Joanne Nelson, who left the bar at 5 p.m. and went to the cafe to get some food. She arrived back at the bar around 6:20 p.m. This is where we're introduced to Tom Vruwink, brother to Jim. She was asked by investigators if she remembers anyone in the bar that evening, possibly with someone else, and who left around 6 to 6:30 p.m. She stated she specifically remembered seeing Tom and his friend still at the bar when she left around 5:15 p.m. Neither Joanne nor Tracy Huber, the bartender, could recall if Tom and his friend were still there between 6:15 and 6:30 p.m. While still at JoJo's Tavern, dispatch informed Sergeant Swayze of another individual that may have information regarding the accident. The officers arrived at the Shuck residence and spoke with Carl and Geraldine. When they arrived, they noticed children playing in the yard. Apparently, these were the children Jim saw while chasing the vehicle and honked his horn to alert them. They remembered seeing a two-door silver car that resembled a Ford Mustang headed northbound on CTHHH, traveling at a high rate of speed with two occupants and their headlights off. Seconds later, they saw another vehicle following the silver one, also at a high rate of speed, honking the horn. That apparently was Jim Vruwink. It was at this time other officers were trying to track down Tom Vruwink to confirm his whereabouts during the accident. Around 11 p.m., Jim called the station to inform officers that his brother Tom was at his home. Deputy Rick Kirst and Sergeant Swayze were dispatched to Jim's home to speak with the Vruwinks. When they arrived, they spoke with Tom and asked him where he was that evening. Now, there are three very important details I want to point out about this interaction. One, at this time, Tom Vruwink was still a possible suspect in the hit and run. Somehow, despite that fact, Sergeant Swayze interviewed Tom at Jim's home with him, Tom, and other Vruwink brother Ron all present during the interview. 2. This was almost 6 hours after the accident, with all of the Vruwink brothers together for several of those hours. And 3. In Sergeant Swayze's report, he cannot recall the name of Ron Vruwink and Tom's friend that was with him at the bar, meaning he didn't even bother taking notes during the interview. Again, this is a sergeant we're talking about. Tom claimed that he and his friend, who we later learn is Roger Yenter, were at JoJo's Tavern until 5:30 p.m. He went on to say he did not hit anyone on CTHHH, and if he had, his brother Jim would have recognized his car. After Tom said this, Jim interjected and said it, quote, definitely was not, end quote, his brother's vehicle. Again, I just feel the need to point out that Jim and Ron were able to be present during questioning of a possible suspect. In fact, lead investigator Reichert wouldn't even interview Tom alone until June 1st, over 2 months after the accident. Sergeant Swayze inappropriately includes his opinion at the end of the report. Quote, the Vruwinks didn't seem overly upset or nervous. Their stories seemed to check out and they seemed genuinely eager to help us find the striking vehicle, end quote. I find this part interesting. This is only hours after the accident. How could you possibly conclude that their stories check out when you haven't had time to check them out? This is a continued theme in the investigation. Investigators seemingly already decide to believe the Vruwink story as soon as they hear it. On March 28, 1995, investigator Mark Gosh was dispatched to follow up on a tip given to the department. The tip was that a car was parked in a barn at that location on the day of the accident. Gosh spoke with Marjorie Wolfhard at the residence. The primary focus for Gosh was her son Larry Wolfhard. He was previously arrested for an OWI and, quote, had a questionable reputation, end quote. Gosh questioned Marjorie on where her son currently is and where he was on 3/24/95, to which she said she wasn't sure where he is now, but on the 24th he came home around 6 p.m. He was there for about an hour and she made him some dinner. Then he took his brother's Ford Ranger to drive to Marshfield to get something for his car. Gosh asked Marjorie if Larry seemed intoxicated when he arrived back home. She said she can always tell when he's drunk, and that night he was not. Marjorie was hesitant to let Officer Gosh look at the vehicle in the barn, but eventually allowed him to check it out. Gosh made note that it was difficult talking to Marjorie as she was either genuinely forgetful or being selective about the information she gave and would even get upset at times. After Officer Gosh got permission, he called lead investigator Riker to let him know there was in fact a car in a barn, but he wasn't sure what exactly he needed to look for, so Riker made his way to the Wolfhard residence. When he arrived, he and Gosh inspected the car. The vehicle was in very poor condition, dirty, dented, and scratched. After looking over the vehicle for some time, it was determined it was not the vehicle in question. After speaking with Dennis Wolfhard, they also decided none of the Wolfhard family were suspects. On 3/29/95, Officer Gosh was given information from another anonymous tip. The tip was that a man named Keith K was overheard telling someone that he had hit a girl. When Gosh arrived at the Keith residence, no one was home, so he left his business card. Officer Gosh then spoke with Ron Tomford on March 30th, 1995. Ron complained that, quote, the Karpinski boys race up and down the roads all the time, end quote. Some of the next part is redacted, but from what I gather, Ron explains to Gosh that he saw Redacted's car, a red Monte Carlo, driving around the same afternoon Deidre was hit. Gosh drives to Redacted person's home to speak with them. He looks at the Monte Carlo, which is being worked on, and actually sitting on blocks in the garage. Later on, Gosh spoke with Diane, last name redacted. She called into the sheriff's department to report that her daughter, then a huge part is redacted. But from what I gather, Diane's daughter told one of her classmates at Vesper Elementary that her father is the one who hit Deidre. When Officer Gosh talked to Diane, she informed him that her and her husband were in the middle of a divorce, and her daughter was telling, quote, a lot of lies and making up stories, end quote. Yet again, it seems Officer Gosh just chose to believe this story and doesn't even bother following up with the husband. Then Officer Gosh spoke with Jim Vruwink later that day. Something very interesting happens here. Gosh states the following in his report, quote, it should be noted, over the years I have had my share of problems with the Vruwink family, end quote. Remember, this is only a few days after the accident, so Officer Gosh hasn't spoken with Jim yet and wanted to get some more general information about what he witnessed. Throughout the interview, Gosh gets the feeling that Jim does not want to talk to him and finishes his report by stating, quote, I could tell that he was not happy about being asked these questions again and did not want to lose any further rapport that the department may have. I quickly ended my conversation, end quote. But that's not even the strangest part. Officer Gosh writes, quote, the next day I was contacted by Lieutenant Levendos, who informed me that he was contacted by the Vruwinks and I was not to contact the Vruwinks and interview them any further, end quote. Wait, so let me get this straight. Jim was not only the, quote, eyewitness to the accident, but also was a suspect, and the lieutenant tells the officer who is tracking down leads to no longer have contact with the eyewitness. On the morning of March 31st, 1995, Officer Gosh received a phone call from Kevin K. A sentence or two of the report is redacted. Gosh goes on to say that Keith sounded relieved to be questioned. He says he was with his father-in-law and other family members on that Friday evening. Apparently, Gosh just took Keith's word for it because there's nothing further in the report about Keith K. and no interviews with any of his family members to confirm his alibi. Investigator Gosh continued to look into a few other possible suspects, all coming up empty-handed. Harry Dolan was a name given to investigator Tom Reichert by Jerry Benton, the private investigator hired by the Week family, as a possible witness that was at JoJo's Tavern that night. Reichert spoke to Jerry about what he saw at the tavern that evening. Jerry stated he not only saw Tom at the bar when he was leaving at 6 p.m., Jerry was positive it was Tom because he has known him for a number of years. I think it's important to point out that this tip was not found by Reichert, but rather the Weeks family investigator. It seems to me getting a list of patrons that were there at JoJo's that night and interviewing them would be a no-brainer. Yet that was never done by Reichert. Dennis Rabb was another name given to Reichert by private investigator Benton as a person who had some information on Tom and Roger's alibi. On July 11th, Reichert spoke with Rabb. He stated that he saw Faye Elliott, a man that was at JoJo's Tavern that night, and backed up Tom and Roger's alibi that they left around 5 at a local horse pull and was told by Elliott that Tom told him to lie for him about his whereabouts, and that there was in fact a period where Elliott didn't know where Tom was. Reichert characterizes this as somewhat contradictory to previous information gathered. To me, that's a clear contradiction, not just somewhat. The next day, July 12, 1995, Reichert has a follow-up interview with Faye Elliott about Rabb's accusation. Elliott, quote, emphatically, end quote, denied the allegation that he lied for Tom. When asked why Rabb would say that, Elliott said that Rabb was, quote, pushing the issue and feels he did this because he believes the Vruwinks are guilty. Not surprising, Reichert offers zero pushback and not only completely buys what Elliott is saying, but also fills the final paragraph with nothing but anecdotal statements by saying, quote, I tend to believe him. Faye Elliott is the type of person who seems to have a very definite sense of right and wrong, and I don't believe that he would lie under these circumstances, end quote. To include these statements in a police report goes against the training manuals used by police departments. According to the Sacramento Police Department report writing manual, quote, a police record is an objective accounting of the relevant and observed facts of the case, and any conclusion made by the reporting officer must be supported by articulated and documented facts. Unsubstantiated opinions or conclusions are never to be included in an effective report, end quote. The time Tom and Roger left the bar is extremely important as to where they are on the road when Deidre is struck. To do this, let's take a further look at Tom's alibi for that evening. We know that Tom and Roger clocked out early, at noon, from their job at Consolidated Paper. We know that they stayed together after clocking out and drove around. They then went to JoJo's Tavern. The exact time of arrival is unknown. Tracy Huber, the bartender that evening, didn't even arrive for her shift until 5 p.m. She remembers serving Tom 2 to 3 mixed drinks, one being a Windsor, Canadian whiskey, and Coke. We know that Roger Yenter, from his own admission, was drunk. Now, because Tom was never given a sobriety test, despite literally admitting to drinking and driving to police, we have to speculate if he was buzzed, drunk, or over the legal limit. Now, the bartender remembers serving him 3 mixed drinks. That alone could raise one's BAC to over the legal limit, but remember, the bartender, Tracy, who served those 3 mixed drinks, arrived at 5 p.m., and Tom claims that they left the bar at 5:30 p.m. So that would be 3 mixed drinks within a 30-minute window. Even if you left at 6, which seems to be the case, and more on that in a moment, 3 mixed drinks within an hour could cause one's BAC to spike very quickly. Not to mention that Tom more than likely consumed alcohol prior to Tracy arriving. According to a diary that Tom's then live-in girlfriend, who would later become his wife and now his ex-wife Tracy Salter kept, Tom drank every day and had a problem with alcohol. She also states that when Tom arrived home at 8:15 p.m., he was very drunk and his eyes were glazed over. Why does it matter if Tom and or Roger were drunk? Well, if they were the drivers of the striking vehicle, this wouldn't be your typical hit-and-run case, but rather vehicular homicide, which of course is not only a much more serious charge, but also means there is no statute of limitations. So we've established with statements from two witnesses that Tom's statement that he and Roger left after 5 p.m. certainly seems to be incorrect. What about the rest of his alibi? Back to the July 1st, 1995 interview between Reichert and Tom. Tom says after he and Roger left JoJo's Tavern, they went to Jim's house. When they arrived at Jim's at 5:15 p.m., he was not there. So from there, they decided to go to Eugene Feltz's house in Arpin. According to Tom, they just so happened to meet Eugene on County Highway North while on their way to his house. They arrived at Eugene's before 5:30 p.m. Tom and Roger meeting Eugene on the way to his house and where it occurred is extremely important. Going from Jim's house to Eugene's typically would mean they travel down CTHHH, the road where the accident happened. However, they claim to have taken County Highway North to Eugene's, which is not the typical route due to it adding additional miles and travel time. Using this route gives Tom and Roger an alibi with Eugene's statement. So why would they take the long way? There has to be a reasonable explanation, right? Unfortunately, we will never know because Reichert never asked that question. That's their whole alibi. Because again, without coincidentally meeting Eugene on the road, there's no one to back up their whereabouts during the time frame of Deidre getting struck. That seems like a pretty important question to ask. They drank a few beers while at Eugene's and left at about 7:30 p.m., not learning about the accident until they went back to Jim's and spoke with Larry Grosskreutz. After speaking with Tom, Reichert includes a very odd statement in his report. He says, quote, "I will be conducting short follow-ups with both Roger Yenter and Eugene Feltz to, quote, lock up Tom Vruwink concerning his whereabouts the night of the accident," end quote. Lock up his statement? The job of an investigator is not to share their opinion, it's to find the facts of the case. On June 6, 1995, Reichert spoke with Eugene Feltz to verify Tom and Roger's alibi. Eugene does say he met them on County Highway North and then went back to his house and drank some beer. He can't even verify that it was March 24th. Not only that, but he also says they met on County Highway North at approximately 6 p.m. Remember, Tom and Roger say it was before 5:30 p.m. when they met on the road. Despite the number of contradicting statements from Feltz, Reichert once again ends the report with the anecdotal statement, quote, "It would certainly appear that the statement made by these witnesses are credible," end quote. So are the statements actually credible? Well, I think I've demonstrated that the alibis from Tom and Roger have some glaring holes to say the least. But what about the witnesses themselves? Well, let's take a look at some history of Tom and Jim Vruwink. Interestingly enough, this is not the first time Jim and Tom were tied to a hit and run. In September of 1984, a man named Brian Rogney stated that while Jim and Tom were racing, Tom collided with his car. He went on to say that Tom left the scene, leaving passengers in his car that were hurt, and that Tom and Jim both had been drinking. During the deposition for the insurance company, Brian says, quote, "Jim Vruwink told every lie he could to make the accident look like my fault. Needless to say, he got caught in every lie, including lying under oath," end quote. Despite that being pretty damning testimony, on July 26, 1995, David Week brought up the 1984 accident to Reichert. To David's surprise, Reichert already knew about it and brushed it off by saying, quote, "I talked with Week for some length about this particular accident. Although I did not investigate it nor have any knowledge of the 1984 accident, I told him what our department's concerns were and how I felt this related to the accident involving his daughter," end quote. The fact that Reichert didn't even bother looking into a previous hit and run case that two of the suspects in a hit and run case were involved in previously is unfathomable. Jim and Tom have had several run-ins with the law over the years. I think it's important to go over some of these incidents to help paint the full picture. All of the following information is public court records. Let's start with Jim Vruwink. On November 7, 1992, Jim was charged with disorderly conduct. The case was dismissed. July 17, 2007, Jim pled guilty to disorderly conduct. In that same case, the charges for criminal damage to property was dismissed. April 13, 2019, Jim pled no contest to a charge of UTV underage operation, which means someone under the age of 18 operates a terrain vehicle. July 23, 2020, Jim pled no contest to speedometer violations. But that's not all. According to court papers that were obtained by Staircase Stories from the Wisconsin Circuit Court, Jim Vruwink was arrested in 2002 for one count of delivery of a controlled substance, 5 grams or less of cocaine. 1 count of escape, and 1 count of possession of cocaine. On January 19, 2002, at approximately 1:30 a.m., officers were dispatched to the Silver Dollar Saloon in Hurley, Wisconsin. When they arrived, they spoke with the business owner, Bob Gallatley. Bob told them 2 men in the saloon had cocaine on them. One of the witnesses, Penny, was a dancer at the saloon and was trying to keep the men occupied until officers arrived. Officer Packmeyer pulled Penny aside to inquire about what happened. She stated that the bigger of the 2 men offered some coke and even showed her what he called an 8-ball. The same man offered cocaine to another dancer, Lisa. While talking to the witnesses, one of the officers observed the bigger man, later identified as Jim Vruwink, reach into his right pocket and then put that same hand under the table. After seeing this, the officer immediately told the 2 men to step outside. Now in front of the saloon, the officer asked Jim if he had anything he shouldn't have on him, to which Jim responded no. Jim agreed to let the officer search him, which came up empty. While one officer stayed outside to keep an eye on the suspects, the other went inside to look under the table where Jim was. Sure enough, when looking under the table, the officer found a vial of white powder. The officer confirmed with Lisa that the vial was in fact the same vial that Jim offered her earlier, not to be confused with the 8-ball that Jim offered to Penny. Officers looked for the 8-ball, but was unable to find it. The 2 men were separately placed in the back of the officer's squad cars. While the officer was talking to one of the men, the other 2 officers started yelling. Jim had somehow gotten out of the squad car and bolted down First Avenue. He wouldn't get far, as Deputy Samartit radioed to other officers that he had caught Jim again by 2nd Avenue. Jim was transported to the Iron County Sheriff's Department. Back at the station, the white powder tested positive for cocaine. From what I can tell, despite the number of laws Jim has broken over the years, he has not served any real time behind bars. Even the 2002 drug arrest, which is a Class G felony and carries up to 10 years in prison and a maximum fine up to $25,000, ended in a deferred prosecution/sentence. Now, Tom doesn't have nearly as long of a rap sheet as his brother, only being in trouble twice. August 23, 1998, Tom pled no contest to a disorderly conduct charge. August 26, 2001, more disorderly conduct charges were dismissed. Now, obviously, just because a person has been arrested and/or charged for crimes in the past doesn't mean that they're a bad person or even capable of this particular crime. I do find Jim's drug arrest to be revealing though. The fact that he tried to get rid of the cocaine and escape when caught is interesting to say the least. Remember when I said Sheriff Illingworth had a clear conflict of interest? Well, let me expand on that. Sheriff Illingworth was and is very close friends with the Vruwink family, specifically Jim. Some may even say they're best friends. According to Tom's ex-wife, Wendy Day, Sheriff Illingworth discussed the Deidre Week case with Tom and Jim, quote, all the time, end quote. Now, there's no official reports of any interviews between the sheriff, Tom, and/or Jim, meaning these discussions, if true, would have been in private and completely inappropriate. Another example of how close the Vruwinks were to Sheriff Illingworth was Ron Vruwink's obituary, where a special thank you was given to Sheriff Illingworth.
Yeah, I know Jim Vruwink. I've known him for some time.
And would you describe your relationship as a friendship or professional?
Jim was a friend of mine.
Okay.
But in no way did I impede the investigation. I mean, if he did it, he did it. I'm not going to protect anybody.
Now, you may think Sheriff Illingworth wasn't the primary investigator on the case, and there was a number of officers and investigators who worked it, so it shouldn't matter that the sheriff had such a close friendship with the Vruwink family, right? Well, not exactly. Because Vesper is such a small town, the sheriff oversees all investigations. So just because his name isn't on the reports doesn't mean he wasn't involved in the investigation. Furthermore, Sheriff Illingworth even admitted the department got their vehicles serviced by TJ's Auto, a company that Tom Vruwink owns.
The Wood County Sheriff's vehicles were regularly serviced at one of the suspect's businesses, which turns out to be true.
Yeah, we did some business with.
Okay, so that would be his.
Correct.
Okay. And was questioned about the crash as a suspect, correct?
I believe so.
It's safe to assume the majority of the department had a relationship with the Vruwinks as well. This is all proven by several officers being removed from the cases solely because the Vruwinks had an issue with them. From the beginning of the investigation, the Week family felt that Sheriff Illingworth was never really on their side. In a letter published on the 27th anniversary of Deidre's death, Brenda and David Week expressed their frustrations with the investigation and Sheriff Illingworth in particular. The Week family revealed some key points of concern in the investigation, one of which was several interactions with Sheriff Illingworth. Just a few weeks after Deidre's death, her grandmother wrote a letter to Illingworth to share her concerns and frustrations with the investigation. Quote, Sheriff Illingworth, first I must say I have always had the greatest respect for you and thought you did your job very well. You always seemed to be on top of things until recently. We, the family, sense a definite lack of willingness on your part and at least one other person in your department to pursue information that could be pertinent evidence. Some of the comments via phone conversation to members of our family were very distasteful. When David spoke to you on Wednesday, April 12th, he did become somewhat unnerved and said something to the effect of, quote, those damn blanks are lying, end quote. You said to him, quote, just tone it down a little, end quote. Then you cut him off by saying you had to go take your 16-year-old daughter for her driver's test. I was appalled. At least you still have your daughter. What a total lack of compassion. Can you imagine how that made David feel? You keep stating you want people to call in if they have any information, yet we keep hearing, quote, no, we haven't heard that, or quote, I haven't read the report yet. And this was told to my husband, quote, well, people out there at Vesper don't like them, so it's probably just revenge, end quote. Concerned people are not making accusations, they're just stating facts, what they heard, saw, times, etc., end quote. She goes on to express concern that many have felt that the sheriff is letting his personal relationships cloud his judgment. Quote, some of us are beginning to feel anger. We have the right to expect you and your department to do everything possible to solve the case and not let your personal feelings become involved, because we feel something is not right here. If you don't like this comment, don't blame the family. We're getting this from the way you and some others are responding to our concerns, end quote. She finished the letter by stating, quote, I hope you read all of this, end quote, and signs it, quote, a very concerned grandmother of Deidre, end quote. The letter seemingly made Sheriff Illingworth very angry. Brenda and David Week recall this reaction in their anniversary letter. Quote, we first met Sheriff Illingworth in his office 2 weeks after we lost Deidre. He immediately slammed the letter on the desk and said, quote, it looks like this is Weeks versus Illingworth, end quote. Lieutenant Levendos witnessed this. The letter was from Deidre's grandma, voicing her concerns on Deidre's case. This letter obviously made Illingworth very upset. His friend, the eyewitness, was being questioned. We were shocked and confused. He never acted as a figure of authority on our behalf. Deidre and her family were not the victims in his eyes, end quote. To make matters worse, Brenda talked about how she felt that Sheriff Illingworth was trying to provoke David into an altercation. Quote, Illingworth then came to our house trying to provoke David into a confrontation. He argued with us and advanced within a few inches of David as to provoke him. We couldn't believe this was happening. Besides that incident, we saw Illingworth seemingly, quote, stake out, end quote, our house as his vehicle sat on a dead-end road across from us. This was the case at Deidre's grandma's house also. All of this was just not right and very threatening. We felt he was mentally unstable. Mentally unstable. That's quite an accusation to make about a sitting sheriff. Turns out, they were exactly right, but more on that later. After this aggressive interaction, the Weeks applied for a restraining order. Quote, we then applied for a restraining order against him. Judge Mason's first words to us were, quote, well, I just want you to know that Brian Illingworth is a friend of mine, end quote. We trusted that he would make the right decision since he was a judge. We were denied, end quote. Try and put yourself in Brenda and David's shoes. The person in charge of investigating your daughter's hit and run not only is best friends with one of the suspects, but also acts aggressively and completely unsupportive. That must have been such a terrible feeling. This isn't even the first time that Illingsworth's integrity in work was called into question. While he was a detective in the 80s, another one of his friends was involved in a serious crime. This was referenced in the anniversary letter. Quote, "We have long been aware of others in our area who have also suffered this purgatory of no justice. That is why on Friday, February 17th, we along with other family members attended the sentencing of John Sarver for the brutal murder of Eleanor Roberts some 38 years previously. We wanted to show our solidarity with the Roberts family and also renew our hope and prayers that Deidre's case would also at some point reach closure." End quote. The Roberts case mentioned in their letter is shockingly similar to Deidre's case. In 1984, Eleanor Roberts was brutally murdered in her home. For over 30 years, the case sat cold. That wasn't until a man named John Sarver was arrested and found guilty for her murder in 2022. Jerome Lippard from On Focus News wrote a great piece exposing Brian Illingsworth's connection to Sarver. Quote, "Unfortunately, not all police officers involved in this case deserve praise. It cannot be said openly that John Sarver was a citizen informant for the Wood County Drug Enforcement Unit in the 1980s. The officer in charge of him and his work was one Detective Brian Illingworth, or as he was known when he was working with Mr. Sarver in the field, Big Al." Retired detective and former Wood County Sheriff Illingworth testified during the trial. While he tried to put on a happy face on his work with Mr. Sarver, it was readily apparent that the former sheriff had gotten too close to his informant. Facts that came out in the trial illustrated this point. First, Mr. Sarver was not fingerprinted when he started his work. This should have happened, but in Sarver's case, it was another officer who fingerprinted him 2 years later. Secondly, Detective Illingworth attended Mr. Sarver's wedding, which is not standard procedure either. Also, a question was asked at trial about Mr. Sarver's getting blackout drunk while being supervised by Illingworth. Clearly, this would be against departmental policy as well. And finally, when Mr. Sarver was being scrutinized in 1988 about his possible role in Eleanor Roberts' murder, there was this interesting meeting at a cabin in Adams County where apparently Sarver and Illingworth were alone before other officers arrived to question Sarver. What, if anything, was discussed at this private interaction has never been revealed. Additionally, I'm aware of one other pertinent fact that didn't come up at trial. In the 1990s, a member of the Roberts family went to then Sheriff Illingworth with a copy of Reader's Digest that contained an article on a new improved DNA test and asked if it might help in the case. The sheriff looked at the family member and tossed the Reader's Digest back at them, saying, quote, "The suspect is a friend of mine," end quote. This is an answer no officer should ever give to a victim's family member. This attitude/conflict might be part of the reason justice was so long delayed in this case, end quote. Doesn't that sound eerily similar to the Deidre Week case? That amount of guilt can seriously start to weigh on a person. In fact, that's possibly what happened to Illingworth in 1997. The News Herald printed a story on May 10, 1997 with the headline, quote, "Sheriff faces troubling times," end quote. It goes on to state that Illingworth was hospitalized for severe depression and drug dependence. Quote, "The revelation that Wood County Sheriff Illingworth has been hospitalized for depression and drug dependency shocked and surprised a lot of his constituents this week, and it has raised some troubling questions. Supposedly, not even members of the Sheriff and Traffic Committee, which oversees the operation of the Sheriff's Department, until a brief press release was circulated Wednesday morning. The release supposedly was given at the request of Illingworth. That is troubling. It is comforting to know that Under Sheriff Randall Rapp has assumed management of the department since Illingsworth's hospitalization began March 17th. But who made that appointment and when? And who was told? Were any of the officials or members of the Sheriff's Department advised of the reason for Illingsworth's absence? And who made the decision to keep the facts undercover until reporters started asking questions of where the sheriff was? While we can appreciate the personal nature of his illness, serious questions could be raised about Illingsworth's ability to perform his duties before he took the leave. The conditions didn't just pop up overnight. Was his job performance impaired before his leave began? The press release contained little information other than to say that he, quote, was making good progress, end quote, and that he was expected to return to office at some unspecific time. That too is a troubling prospect. An armed sheriff managing a sizable department that oversees the safety and security of all county residents needs to be performing at peak levels. Illingworth found himself in the middle of a controversy in the department's investigation of the death of a young girl in an auto accident near her home. And more recently, he was challenged about the vast use of sheriff's department vehicles, which led the county board to establish some new use policies. End quote. As mentioned in the article, there was very little details about his hospitalization. However, a few months later, on December 18, 1997, the Daily Tribune got their hands on a transcript from a phone call made to the sheriff's department from a doctor that revealed just how serious Sheriff Illingworth's mental health issue really was. The following are portions of the transcript of the March 29th taped telephone conversation in the Wood County Sheriff's Department Dispatch Center regarding Sheriff Brian Illingworth. Wood County Sheriff's Department, Linda. This is Dr. O'Rourke. I'm a psychiatrist in Janesville, Wisconsin. This is Rock City. I was just in contact with Brian Illingworth, and I need a car to go out to his house. Please, he's I know he works with you guys, but I need someone to go out to his house. Dispatcher, is there anybody there with him now? Is Joanna Illingworth or Dr. O'Rourke? I assume his wife is. I talked to her on the phone and he reported to me that he was thinking about building a bomb and he's very suicidal, but I think he needs to be brought in somewhere. The call was transferred to Deputy Rick Kirst. Quote, my dispatcher transferred me over to you. Dr. O'Rourke, yeah, Kirst. She was saying that you don't have real good news for me, huh? Doctor, no, Brian's, talking about building bombs and guns, all kind of crazy stuff. Dr. O'Rourke, his wife called and stated basically she is concerned. And then I got him on the phone and he's talking all kinds of stuff about maybe I'll do a bomb and maybe this and maybe that. And I'm not sure he'll do that, but a little later in the transcript, Under Sheriff Randy Rapp comes on the line. So I'm on my way. I'm leaving Marshfield right now. The next part of the transcript shows that the Wood County Sheriff's Department was trying to cover all this up. Dispatcher, okay, I'm not making a complaint on this. I don't want anything in writing on this. Rapp, that's probably wise. Okay, later on, Lieutenant Levendos comes on the line. Dispatcher, I put nothing in the computer on this. Lieutenant, that's a good idea. Dispatcher, I think we should rip the tape out and burn it. Lieutenant, yeah. Dispatcher, I want the garbage cans burnt tonight so there's no notes. Lieutenant, yeah, that's probably a good idea. Lieutenant, we'll have to cheat a little bit on this. Dispatcher, we have to. We can't let them, other Sheriff's Department employees, get a hold of this. It will destroy him. Illingworth. Dispatcher, now I'll burn this. Now I'll burn this tape. Sure as sure, boy. Lieutenant, that's right. Back the tape up. Deputy Dean Barris. I think it's kind of serious what we're dealing with here. Like big time serious. Barris, okay, so make sure you tell the people in dispatch that, who's all in there? Dispatch, there was only one, and me. Now it's not that way, and we've already discussed it, and it's done. And, right, because it's totally hear no evil, see no evil. Dispatcher, that's right. Barris, okay, so if anything leaks out of there from all of us that know about it, that, it's in a higher authority. Dispatcher, that's right. Barris, and then they can take care of it. The dispatcher went on to talk to another person. Would you tell him, I don't know he can do it, but I would like to have this tape destroyed. Dispatcher, I said if there's anything, any way he can get this tape that went on tonight and destroy it, get it out of here, the better. There's a part of the call that Lieutenant Levendos insinuates that Illingworth was clearly struggling prior to this. Dispatcher, God, I hope nothing happens to Brian. Oh God. Lieutenant, that's weird too. Sounds like the cookie is crumbling. Dispatcher, yeah. Lieutenant, well, I knew Brian was at a breaking point just by his actions. Why was he allowed to continue running the sheriff's department if people knew that he was having mental health issues? And more importantly, why the hell is the sheriff constantly finding himself in the middle of these situations? Why does he have good friends that constantly get themselves in these situations? Let's go back to Jim's statement and some of the inconsistencies. Remember the car part that Jim was taking back to the Frams? As I explained earlier, Jim was never actually able to bring them that part. Instead, his hired hand Lonnie Grosskreutz brought it to them after Jim witnessed the hit and run. There's one question I have, which of course was never asked by the investigators. How did Jim communicate to Lonnie that he needed him to bring the part to the gas station for the Frams? Tracy Stalter, Jim's girlfriend, told Reichert in an interview on September 7, 1995, that when she got home at about 6:35 p.m., Jim and his 2 children were already home. She says that all 4 of them were going to go eat dinner after Jim got back from taking the part into town. Jim left the house with the part in hand. Remember, Jim says he witnessed the accident while driving the part into town. But my question, again, is when did he communicate with Lonnie? On July 1st, 1997, Lieutenant Levendos was contacted by Carl Idzvug, an investigative producer for the TV show Inside Edition. After Carl spoke with the Week family and Jim Vruwink, he noticed some glaring inconsistencies and had some concerns with the way the investigation was being ran. He had a variety of questions that mirrored some of the same questions I have. Let's focus on just one, and that's if Jim possibly had a cell phone during the accident. Levendos says in his report, quote, Carl was questioning whether or not the Wood County Sheriff's Department obtained any cellular phone records from James Vruwink pertinent to the time of the accident, end quote. He goes on to say, quote, this officer checked with James Vruwink and it was not believed the cellular phone played any part in the investigation, end quote. From the way the report reads, no one ever asked Jim if he had a cell phone at the time. This conversation with Carl is over 2 years after the accident. How does that happen? Jim tells Levendos that he didn't get a cell phone until shortly after the accident, and he tells him he can call his cellular company, US Cellular, to confirm this, which the lieutenant does, and the company confirms that the number wasn't active until March 29th, 1995. Okay, so what am I getting at? Well, first off, again, why wasn't that asked and looked into before? 2, Lieutenant Levendos only called the cellular company that Jim gave him. In 1995, while not as many as we have now, there were several other cellular companies. Why didn't he contact the other companies? To me, the lieutenant was called out by Carl and thought to himself, oh crap, we didn't look into that, and only called the cellular company that Jim told him about to appease Carl and get him off his back. In the beginning, the Weeks were supportive of Jim and even sent him flowers. Quote, initially we were supportive of the eyewitness, end quote, Brenda wrote in the 27th anniversary letter. Quote, we in fact sent a dozen roses to him to show that, but as the days passed, questions arose in our minds and we eventually got to the point where we didn't believe he was revealing all that he knew, end quote. One of the reasons the Weeks' perspective changed on Jim and the Vruwinks in general was because of the strange behavior that started to occur. Officer Hewer spoke with Robert and Marge Loonstra on April 11, 1995. Marge told the officer that a few days after the accident, she was at Riverview Hospital paying a bill when she started talking to an employee. The person is only identified in the report by their maiden name of Schill. During the conversation, Schill told Marge that they had witnessed Ron Vruwink being, quote, emotionally shook regarding this particular accident, end quote. They also stated that they felt it was very odd that Ron would be so upset about this accident as he had no particular connection to it. On that same day, Officer Hewer spoke with David Week at the Schultz residence. David completely disagreed with the statement made by Jim Vruwink in an interview to Channel 7, which is the same interview I tried everything I could to get a hold of, but for some reason was completely ignored. Jim stated that he stopped and checked on Deidre to make sure she was alright, got in his car, pulled into Lori Griffith's driveway to turn around, and while in the driveway, he claims he honked his horn to summon help. He states he waited until someone was coming out, then pulled out and chased the striking vehicle. However, David said he never heard a horn, only that loud thud. Furthermore, the homeowner of the driveway that Jim pulled into also says she definitely did not hear a horn. In that same interview, David also described strange behavior he witnessed by Jim and Ron Vruwink at Deidre's wake. David states that Ron and Jim were both extremely emotional and couldn't even look him in the eye. Others at the Schultz residence confirmed seeing the strange behavior as well. Even more people in Vesper started noticing the glaring inconsistencies and odd behavior by the the Vruwinks. Around this time, Reichert stated in an April 20th, 1995 report that he had received 26 anonymous reports stating that Jim or Tom were the ones who hit Deidre. Reichert follows up by saying, quote, "There seems to be a concerted effort in the Vesper area to link this family to the hit-and-run accident," end quote. He acknowledges that these rumors are partly a result of the inconsistencies in Jim's story. Because of the questions surrounding Jim and his eyewitness testimony, he was brought in to take a polygraph test. On May 11th, 1995, Jim walked into the Marshfield Police Department expecting to gain the confidence of the public, while the Week family was hoping for answers. Unfortunately, the theme of incompetence and unprofessionalism we've come to expect from this investigation continued as the polygraph created more questions than answers. Laverne Regal would administer the polygraph to Jim. Laverne was a 30-plus year veteran of the Marshfield Police Department and was the very first polygraph examiner in the Marshfield area. Despite the impressive resume, the exam Laverne ran on Jim was completely unorthodox and one could even say unprofessional. Before we get into the results of the polygraph, let's go over the standard prep and procedures that go into a polygraph before the test is even done. According to polygraphguide.com, quote, "The polygraph examiner receives and reviews the facts of the case. The examiner formulates the specific test questions based upon the facts of the case and the examinee's version of the events," end quote. So the administrator receives all the facts. In the case of an investigation, they receive all the reports and formulates the test questions before they sit down to administer the polygraph. Well, I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear this, but that was never done for this polygraph. Investigator Reichert writes, quote, "Prior to the polygraph exam, I was able to meet with Laverne and speak with him concerning the questions and the case in general. I explained to Laverne what had occurred during the case and some of the concerns that in essence the village and certain individuals had concerning Jim Vruwink," end quote. He goes on to state, quote, "With Laverne, I helped him formulate questions that were reasonably inclusive and addressed most of our concerns with Jim Vruwink," end quote. The following is from Laverne's official polygraph report. Quote, "No new information was gathered on the pretest due to the fact that I was able to speak to Tom Reichert," end quote. Wow, that is insane. According to the Department of Justice, quote, "The pretest interview conducted prior to an actual polygraph examination is vital to the diagnostic examiner not only in obtaining unambiguous records, but also in the overall interpretation of the subject's truthfulness," end quote. And Laverne just completely skipped that step. But wait, it gets even worse. The most damning and shocking part of Laverne's report is when he states, quote, "I didn't have a copy of the reports because they are so extensive that it would be almost impossible to read them all," end quote. This is hard to believe this is a legitimate police investigation, honestly. This was 6 weeks after the accident. There is absolutely no reason why Laverne didn't have time to review the reports. What this tells me is that Reichert came up with the questions, not Laverne Regal. That's completely unprofessional. 5 questions were asked to Jim. There were no reactions to the questions, except for one. That question was, quote, "Do you know for sure who struck Deidre Week with a motor vehicle?" end quote. Jim answered no. Laverne says in the report, quote, "The only minus that I had on the whole examination was a little bit on the question if he knows who done this," end quote. That's interesting, but we'll get back to that in a bit. But I find it extremely frustrating and downright unacceptable that this polygraph was done in this manner, especially for the Week family, but also for Jim as well. If he was in fact just a witness and not hiding anything, this should be almost as infuriating for him as it is for the Weeks. Because of the incompetence of the Wood County Sheriff's Office, his innocence will continue to be put in doubt. On August 30th, 1995, Reichert received a call from Brenda Week. Brenda explained how over the past 2 weeks, the Weeks family have been receiving harassing and even threatening phone calls. She describes the man as having a, quote, "very gruff-sounding voice," end quote. On one of the phone calls, the man told Brenda that the Vruwink family is hiring, quote, "2 big lawyers from Madison," end quote, to, quote, "take care of the Weeks," end quote. He went on to say that the whole Vruwink family were coming down from as far as Minnesota to meet and, quote, determine a proper course of action for dealing with the Weeks, end quote. Brenda worked with their phone company to put a tap on her line for future calls and to try to trace the calls that already occurred. The phone company was able to trace back to Jim Vruwink. However, for some reason he doesn't care to share, Officer Riker believed this to be an uncle of Jim Vruwink and not the eyewitness. On September 6, 1995, Special Agent John Rayrauer and Investigator Tom Reichert interviewed Lori Griffith. Lori tells them how since the accident, she has been harassed by Jim Vruwink and his girlfriend. She went on to describe the harassment as Jim pulling into her driveway, then, quote, flipping her off, end quote, and Jim riding her bumper while driving. This most likely is a response to Lori defying Jim's claim that he pulled into her driveway, sounded his horn, and waited until she came out, which again, she states, never happened. A few days later, Rayrauer and Reichert interviewed Robert and Marjorie Loonstra. They too told them that they felt harassed by Jim Vruwink, his girlfriend, and his brothers. They described the behavior as the three of them seeing them out and just staring at them. They attributed this to them helping with the investigation and communicating with the Week family. A few weeks went by when Reichert received a phone call on October 16, 1995 from a man named Bill Winch. Bill wanted to file a report about an incident with Jim and Tom Vruwink. Approximately 3 weeks earlier at an auction in Wausau, Jim and Tom threatened him, saying, quote, "We'll kick the fucking shit out of you, you fucking asshole," end quote. Bill stated that he felt this was in response to him putting up a petition at his store. The petition was started by the Week family. It was calling for the Attorney General to get involved with the investigation. Bill asked Investigator Reichert about getting a restraining order against Jim and Tom, but Reichert seemingly brushed it off and said, quote, "It's not necessary," end quote. On December 22, 1995, David Week reported to Reichert that harassing phone calls were still coming to their home. He described a series of 3 calls over roughly 20 minutes. The first, he could only hear an engine revving up in the background, which is particularly sickening due to what happened to Deidre. The next call, the person called him an asshole and hung up. And the third was just heavy breathing. A frustrated David said he laid into the person on the last call, calling him a barrage of names before hanging up. These calls were not able to be traced back to anyone. It seems the person smartened up and learned how to call anonymously. Jim's strange behavior continued for years. On March 26, 1998, Reichert got a call from Jerry Leggett regarding the Deidre Week case. Jerry told Reichert about a Ford F-150 he purchased from TJ's Auto, the Vruwink car lot. He explained that the very next day of purchasing the truck, it broke down and wouldn't start. He brought it back to TJ's and got it repaired. Then it happened again. After the truck broke down for a third time, Jerry decided to take the truck to a different dealership after the Vruwink started to become, quote, hostile. When Jerry took the car to Stevens Auto, the owner told him that this was approximately the 3rd car that has been brought into his shop from TJ's Auto. He explained how he believes the odometers may have been tampered with because all of the vehicles he inspected from there had similar readings. After inspecting the truck, Steven told Jerry that he believed the truck had been submerged in a lake or body of water, reconditioned, and sold. After hearing that, Jerry was concerned that this vehicle may have been used in the hit and run of Deidre, hit in a lake or something, and then sold. Investigator Reichert assured him that that is not the case and the striking vehicle was a car, not a truck. Things got even more strange when Jerry told the investigator about a time he took the truck to TJ's Auto along with a woman he was dating at the time. When Jerry and his date arrived, Jim completely, quote, freaked out, end quote, and started yelling, quote, "Is this a setup? Did Reichert and Rayrauer send her?" End quote. The reason apparently Jim freaked out was because Jerry's date worked for the Adams County Sheriff's Department. Jerry explained to Jim that this was his girlfriend who just so happened to come along to bring the truck in. After Jim calmed down, he said, quote, "They were looking at me in the Deidre case," end quote. Does that seem like a normal reaction to seeing a cop? Over the years, Brenda and David Week have done everything humanly possible to find out who hit their little girl. David even desperately offers to see a hypnotherapist to try and tap into what he saw that day in case he may have overlooked or forgot something. That completely breaks my heart to hear. In May of 2021, the Week family paid over $600 to get an extensive case study done on Deidre's death. The complete study can be found in the sources below, but the author, who remains anonymous, most likely to shield themselves from a defamation lawsuit from the Vruwinks, brings up some very compelling points. They also point blank call out Jim and Tom Vruwink as well as Roger Yenter. They claim they reviewed over 2,066 pages of documents and approximately 500 hours of time went into it. Here are the 5 key points made in the study. Please keep in mind the following is not my opinion, but rather taken verbatim from the case study. Again, I must state no one has been found guilty of this crime. Quote, while there are other possible suspects, i.e. Scott Karoliffe, Carmen Grutzmacher, other Vruwink family members, there appears to be a strong circumstantial case that indicates Tom Vruwink and Roger Yenter were the 2 people in the car that hit Deidre Week and that they were the perpetrators of the crime. 2. They were both intoxicated at the time and thus the crime was vehicular homicide. 3. The sole eyewitness, Jim Vruwink Jr., was aware of who was involved and orchestrated a cover-up that continues to this day. 4. That the work of the Wood County Sheriff's Department was poorly done and compromised in large part due to a very close personal relationship between the Vruwinks and the then Wood County Sheriff, Brian Illingworth. Related to this, a circumstantial case can be made. The former sheriff discussed this case with the Vruwinks and thus compromised the work of his department. Also related to this, it should be noted the relationship between the Vruwinks and Illingworth continues to this day, and that it would be reasonable to conclude that the ex-sheriff has knowledge of the role the Vruwinks played in this crime. End quote. It goes on to give a theory in detail on what they feel happened. Quote, the striking vehicle was driven by Tom Vruwink with Roger Yenter as a passenger. Jim Vruwink Jr. observed the accident. After the homicide, both cars went north on CTHHH and pulled into Jim Vruwink's driveway. They hurriedly talked and came up with a bare bones plan. Jim goes back to the scene. Tom and Yenter go to Sherry with the striking vehicle. They realize several witnesses have seen them on the road, including David Week. They can't just all run. So Tom and Yenter take off to Feltes. Jim calls 911 and then goes back to the scene. The striking car is hit at Feltes and later destroyed or buried. Jim buys time at the scene. Tom, who was legally drunk, gets back to Marshfield after hiding the car. Yenter goes home to Custer. After doing his thing with the police, Jim Jr. gets a hold of other members of the Vruwink family. Tom comes back to Jim's house. They compare stories, bringing brother Ron, who has been contacted, into things and prep. At around 11 p.m., Jim Jr. calls the police in for the "we didn't do it" story at his house. End quote. The reason I wanted to make this documentary is because the Week family deserved justice for their little girl. And again, Deidre's story has never been told in this much detail before. This case may be 30 years old, but you better believe the pain that Brenda, David, and the entire Week family feel every day is still very fresh. The only way this case gets solved is if someone comes forward and confesses. A confession is much more likely to happen the older the perpetrators get. The closer to Judgment Day they get, the more they feel the need to confess and repent for their sins. This is a sentiment shared with Brenda in the 27th anniversary letter. Quote, with the Sarver conviction and with the sheriff and a Wood County Police Department that now is committed to equal justice with no favorites, we are hopeful that someone will now finally come forward and reveal the whole truth about what happened that tragic evening. One of the stunning revelations in the Robert Sarver trial was that there was a man who had knowledge of what happened at the murder scene, but kept it secret for 35 years answers out of fear. As he came near the end of his life, the burden of that secret became so great that he went to the authorities and gave riveting testimony at the trial. There are persons who know what happened and who was driving the car that hit and killed Deidre. It is our prayer that someone with that knowledge will now have the courage to come forward before they pass away. It is never too late if you're still alive to tell the truth. We will continue to pursue. End quote. I'd like to take a moment of silence for Deidre Week. If you have any information regarding this hit and run, please contact the Wood County Sheriff's Department at 715-421-8700 or by going to the link below. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on The Staircase.